The trees whispered in a language they almost understood. The forest had no edge. No clear moment where the road ended and the woods began. One moment there was gravel underfoot and sky above. The next, the canopy closed like a mouth finishing a sentence. The light changed first, fractured into thin, greenish slats that shifted even when the air did not. It felt less like walking into shade and more like being measured. They stopped speaking without noticing they had done so. The ground was soft with centuries of rot. Damp earth breathing up the smell of rain that had fallen long before any of them arrived. Moss clung to roots like old bandages. The trees stood too close together, trunks pressed shoulder to shoulder, bark ridged and puckered as though grown around old injuries. Somewhere far above, wood creaked, not from wind but from weight, from slow internal strain. The first whisper was mistaken for memory. A breath of sound slid through the leaves, soft and intimate, brushing the edge of hearing. Not words exactly, more like the cadence of them. The rise and fall was familiar in the way lullabies are familiar long after the lyrics are gone. "Did you hear that?" one of them asked, barely audible. No one answered. They were listening now, heads tilted, breath shallow. The forest responded with stillness so complete it felt deliberate. Even the insects seemed to hold back, as though waiting for a cue. Then the whisper came again. It threaded between trunks, folding itself around them, brushing their ears with syllables that never quite finished forming. There were sounds like home without the H, like remember without the ending. Pieces of childhood rhymes. The half-words parents use when soothing a frightened child. Familiar enough to ache. The canopy shifted overhead, leaves sliding against one another without wind. Light dappled the forest floor in slow, drifting patterns, shadows stretching and shrinking as though testing their reach. A tree leaned, not falling, not swaying, just inclining itself a fraction closer, its bark groaning softly. They told themselves the forest was old. Old things made noises, old things settled. Still, the whispers followed. As they moved deeper, the paths began to change. A trail they had marked with bright tape curved back on itself, then narrowed, then vanished entirely beneath a weave of roots that had not been there moments before. Roots rose from the soil like knuckles pushing through skin, rearranging the ground with quiet purpose. Each detour felt less like getting lost and more like being guided somewhere none of them had agreed to go. The language grew clearer, not clearer in meaning, but in shape. Consonants pressed against the backs of their teeth. Vowels hung heavy, unfinished. It felt like trying to recall a dream just after waking. The certainty that it made sense, paired with the horror of losing it. They realized slowly that the whispers did not pause when they stopped moving. They did not change when spoken to. They continued at a steady pace, like narration, like observation. Bark patterns began to catch their eyes. Swirls and cracks that repeated too often to be natural. Symbols that looked like letters remembered wrong, etched shallowly into the tree's skin. Some resembled their own names, almost. One had the right number of strokes but bent the wrong way, as if written by something that had learned the idea of writing without learning the rules. Shadows slipped where they should not. A silhouette moved across the forest floor while the sun remained fixed. Another lagged behind its tree, peeling away for a heartbeat before snapping back into place. When one of them turned too quickly, the shadow froze mid-motion, as if startled. The whispers deepened. They began to recognize patterns, not meanings, roles. This one was marked by impatience, that one by doubt, another by the quiet weight of guilt. The sounds wrapped around each of them differently, lingering longer, pressing closer. The forest did not use names. It did not need to. It knew them. Panic set in not as a spike, but as a pressure. A slow tightening in the chest. They tried to leave. The forest leaned in response. Trunks tilting just enough to narrow the gaps between them, branches lowering to brush hair and shoulders with damp leaves. The air moved in shallow pulses, breath-like, warm and close, as though the woods itself were inhaling around them. The whispers grew more insistent, overlapping now, fragments stacking on fragments. Words brushed the edges of understanding. Walked, waited, watched. Past tense. always past tense. One of them laughed. Too loud, too sharp, and the sound died a few feet from their mouth, swallowed by bark and moss. The forest absorbed it, then resumed its murmur, unbothered. It was then they understood the worst part. The whispers were not asking. They were reciting. The forest was not trying to communicate with them. It was speaking about them, cataloging, contextualizing, folding their presence into a story that had begun long before and would continue long after they were gone. The symbols on the bark shifted subtly, lines deepening, curves correcting themselves as comprehension grew. The paths beneath their feet rearranged once more, forming a rough circle without edges. No entrance, no exit, just continuity. The whisper changed tone. The cadence slowed, softened, almost gentle, almost kind. And finally, they deciphered a phrase that did not drift away. They will be remembered. The forest leaned closer, shadows overlapping, roots settling into their final places. The whispers did not stop as the light dimmed. They simply continued the story, adjusting tense as needed. Their tent was zipped from the outside when they tried to leave. The forest had settled into its night routine long before they did. Owls traded soft questions across the dark, a low, rhythmic who in reply echoing through the trees. The wind moved gently, just enough to brush the canopy and stir the needles underfoot. Inside the tent, the world was reduced to familiar comforts. The faint smell of nylon and damp earth, the steady warmth trapped by zipped canvas, the quiet assurance that the thin barrier between them and the dark was closed, secure, and under their control. They lay side by side, whispering about nothing. Tomorrow's hike, the way the stars looked earlier through the branches. How strange it felt to be so far from cell service, from roads, from anyone who might pass by accidentally. The nearest trailhead was miles away. No other hikers' fires dotted the darkness. Just their small campsite, a ring of stones, and the tent nestled among trees that stood older and taller than anything back home. When the wind paused, the silence felt deep enough to press against the fabric. It wasn't frightening yet, just expansive, the kind of quiet that made every small sound inside the tent seem loud. A zipper tab clicking softly when someone shifted. The whisper of breath. The slow fog of condensation blooming and fading on the inner wall as they exhaled. They slept. Something woke one of them, no sound exactly, more the absence of it. The owls had stopped. The wind no longer moved the leaves. The forest had gone still in a way that felt deliberate, like a held breath. "Did you hear that?" a voice murmured. "Hear what?" came the reply, thick with sleep. There was a pause. Outside, something brushed the tent. Not a step, too light for that, but a faint drag like fingers testing the canvas. The nylon shifted under the pressure. A whispery rasp that crawled along the surface and then stopped. Probably a branch, they told themselves, or a curious animal. The woods were full of both. The sound came again, closer to the front of the tent this time. The zipper gave a tiny click, so soft it could have been imagined. They froze, listening. The texture of the tent wall felt suddenly vivid under their palms, thin, vulnerable, separating warm breath from cold night air. Shadows moved faintly as moonlight filtered through the trees, reshaping the dark silhouettes outside. The zipper didn't move again, but the silence afterward felt wrong. Waited. Minutes passed. Their breathing slowed. Maybe they'd dreamed it. Then the zipper slid. Just an inch. The sound was unmistakable. The gentle, controlled rasp of metal teeth engaging fabric. It stopped again as if whoever or whatever was touching it had reconsidered. "Don't," one of them whispered, not sure to whom. The zipper didn't open further. Instead, it moved the other way. Slowly, carefully. The sound was almost polite, like someone tidying up after themselves. They waited until the cold crept deeper into the tent and fear outweighed caution. When one of them finally reached for the zipper from the inside, the tab wasn't where it should have been. They found it after fumbling in the dark, down at the bottom, fully closed. "Okay," someone said, forcing a laugh that cracked halfway through. "Funny. You zipped it." I didn't. Well, I didn't either. They tried to open it. The zipper resisted, not jammed, not broken. It simply wouldn't move, as if held firm from the outside. They pressed harder, the nylon stretching and whining under their grip. The sound carried too far in the silence. Their breath fogged the inside of the tent, turning the small space cloudy and dim. The air smelled sharper now, metallic with fear. They stopped pulling, suddenly aware of how loud they were, how exposed. "What if it's someone messing with us?" one whispered. "No one's out here," the other replied. "There's no one." They listened. Nothing. No footsteps. No breathing. Just the vast, unnatural stillness of the forest beyond the canvas. Eventually, they tried again. The zipper didn't budge. They unzipped a small vent near the top instead and peered out. Moonlight revealed the campsite in pale fragments. The fire pit, cold and scattered with ash. Their packs, the uneven ground. No footprints disturbed the soil. No shapes moved between the trees. But the trees looked closer. Not by much. Just enough that the space between trunks seemed tighter than it had earlier, the shadows thicker, overlapping in ways that made depth hard to judge. When they shined a headlamp, the beam caught the bark of a tree they were certain had been farther away before. They zipped the vent closed. Time stretched. The cold seeped in. Every sound inside the tent, the shift of fabric, the scrape of a knee against the floor, felt amplified. Outside remained utterly silent. When they finally forced the zipper with all their strength, something answered. Not a voice. Pressure. The tent wall bowed inward slightly, as if the forest itself had leaned closer to listen. They stopped. Morning came without birdsong. The light was wrong. Dim, filtered, as though the canopy had thickened overnight. When they tried again to leave, the zipper slid easily this time. Outside, the campsite was altered. The fire pit was half buried under fresh needles. Their packs were closer to the tent than they remembered. Around them, faint depressions marred the ground. Footprints that led nowhere, fading into untouched soil after only a step or two. They packed quickly, hands shaking. When they turned to leave, they realized the trail was gone. Not obscured, absent. Trees stood where the path should have been, their roots woven together like intent. That's when they noticed the inside of the tent. Pressed into the floor, beneath where they had slept, were shallow impressions. Not footprints. Handprints. From the inside,